Okay, everyone, thank you all so much. So we're going to be working on chapter one today. We're going to try to get through it as quickly as possible because I know since we lost the day on Monday, I definitely want for us to try to, cover the main points of chapter one, so that way we can move on to chapter two next week, which deals with the text constitution. So we'll discuss chapter one here, and the next week we'll go more to detail on the Texas Constitution here. So let me go ahead and share our screen, and then that way we can get started here. Okay, let's see. And then let me go back over here. Okay, everyone. So obviously, of course, chapter one with Texas politics, ideal and reality, that is our textbook. It's talking about the context of Texas politics. Now, really quickly, what I want for us to kind of look at this, and then we'll come back to that really quickly, is I want for you all to understand that this chapter is going to be very history based. So we're going to have to kind of go through this a little bit quicker than I would like, because since we lost this day on Monday. So we'll kind of touch on this history really quickly. We won't spend too much time on it, but it is important that we do kind of cover the history a little bit, because we definitely do need to understand where Texas gets its unique political culture from. And one of the main reasons is, in terms of why Texas has the political culture that it has, is that Texas has a very rich and unique history. In terms of states amongst the United States, Texas probably has the most interesting, if not, one of the most, if not the most interesting histories out there in terms of, of the states. I mean, you're familiar with the Six Flags of Texas, right? Technically, down here in South Texas, we have seven flags, because we have the Republic of the Rio Grande that was, that had formed, in the early 1840s. Over in East Texas, they had, they had they had the not the Fremont, the Fredonia, because Fremont is over in California. They had the Fredonia Republic over there in Nacogdoches. So you can see that that even in some parts of the state, they even had seven flags. So just, like us here in the Valley, and as well as Laredo and South Texas here. So we're going to take a look at a little bit of that history. So with these objectives here, by the end of this chapter, you should be able to give a brief account of the causes and consequences of the major events in Texas history, such as the Texas Revolution, slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, the cotton and oil industries, world wars and depression, political changes from the old South to modern Texas, and the state's evolution to a modern economy, right? So when we look at Texas history, we're not just going to look at historical events and why Texas is the way it is today, but also there's also a lot of economic shifts and economic reasons as to why Texas has the unique political culture that it has here, that we will discuss here within this class. We're going to take a look at the different industries that have, that have set up here in Texas. And the interesting thing about these different industries, everyone, is that, when we think of like Spindletop, that happened at the turn of the 20th century, and even before then, we had, the King cotton industry, with cotton being, the first major cash crop in Texas, and then also the cattle drives in the 1870s. The point that I usually like to make to my students is that those industries are still around today. Like, we still have tons of ranching. We still have lots of cows, here in Texas, for beef exportation, as well as cotton growing. And of course, oil and natural gas is still a huge part of the state, with two of the largest oil producing companies out there, ExxonMobil being based out of Houston and Valero being based out of San Antonio. Oil is still a big part of Texas. It's just that we have diversified so much to now we have a lot more industries, right? We've got the space industry with NASA here. We've got telecommunications with AT&T being headquartered in Dallas. Now we have Tesla coming over here even more recently now, right? So we have a much more diverse economy than what Texas started to begin with. But what I want for y'all to see is that with those new industries, that definitely has created, there definitely are some some political ramifications of that, right? So, and then summarize democratic theory. These last ones, this is what we're going to spend most of our time on here. Summarize democratic theory and the standard that it supplies us in order to permit us to evaluate the democratic legitimacy of any state or country. So we are going to take a look at what democratic theory is, what is a democracy, what makes a healthy democracy, what are the components of a healthy democracy. Discuss whether it is desirable, even possible, for Texas to have a foreign policy. We're going to talk about how that Texas is involved with foreign policy because of the fact that Texas shares an international border with Mexico, right? So you're probably familiar with some of the issues and the controversies that we've seen with immigration as well as border security. These two, they're not quite the same, but they usually go hand in hand. So we're gonna take a look at this question. Does Texas have the right to have a foreign policy Do they have a right to try to secure an international border, or is that mostly the federal government's responsibility? We're going to take a look at how Texas, might feel that they have a stake in this, right? So we'll talk about that here. Give a brief description of the three political cultures and explain how they apply to Texas. So I would say that this is probably the most important aspect of our chapter 1 discussion here. I definitely want for you all to understand the three political cultures and which of those three political cultures do we see in Texas. Summarize the overall pattern of the relationship of Texas government to the Texas economy, and explain why it's difficult to determine if Texas is or is not a good place to live. There's a good video that I have there in the module that talks about how powerful is Texas. I definitely recommend for y'all to take a look at that quick 5-minute video. It talks about some of the the pros and cons of Texas when we look at a lot of the industry that's coming over to Texas, but does that help out with everyone within Texas, or are there still issues with poverty in Texas, right? So definitely take a look at that video, and it'll talk about that more. And then discuss the ratio of Anglo, Latinos, and African Americans in the Texas population, and explain why these ratios matter to a book about state government. We definitely have to look at the demographics of Texas and who lives in Texas, because that definitely goes a long way in terms of explaining some of the the political culture, and as a result of that political culture, the political events and the political decisions, the elections that happen, who gets into office, what are the laws and policies that are passed because of who gets into office, due to who is voting for these people, things like that. So we have to look at all that, to give us a better understanding of the overall Texas political culture. And I am going to add this article later on in our class that just in July, over the summer, we had news broke that Latinos have now become the largest demographic group in Texas. Originally, Anglos and Latinos were neck and neck in terms of the people populating Texas, but now Latinos have actually eclipsed the Anglo population in Texas, and so that's interesting, right? Because there had been talk in terms of when that would happen, and now it's happened, right? So now Texas is a majority, not just a majority minority state, because if you take the Latinos and the African Americans and the Asian Americans as well, that would give you more than 50%. But now, Latinos are the largest group in general. So so obviously you combine that does make a majority minority state, and then Latinos are the largest group, compared to Anglo. So we'll talk about, what that will do for the, for the future in terms of, the Texas political culture here. So, okay. Now, like I mentioned to you all before, so there's going to be a lot of history that, so again, we don't quite have as much time as I would like to delve into this history really quickly, but this should be somewhat of a review for you all, because, you probably have taken Texas history way back when, right? Probably like in 7th grade. It definitely would be good to kind of have, I know there is a Texas history class at the college level. I don't know if STC offers it. I know other universities do. I know, like at TAMU, where I got my my master's in history and political science, my mentor professor teaches that class. Dr. Jerry Thompson, he teaches Texas history, does a fantastic job of it. So it would be good to have that class, because I do feel like it would be good to kind of have a refresher on Texas history. But again, for the interest of time, we'll just kind of go through this really quickly. So just be aware, it talks about Midland Mini, of course, that this was the first, the oldest, documented remains, of a human here in Texas, in the Leander area, which is a little bit to the north west of Austin. That area is also becoming, just kind of as an aside, for those of you who are familiar with what's going on in Austin, right? That Austin has really expanded in the last 20 years, and you're seeing all of these other areas, nearby Austin. They're also, expanding, and Leander and Cedar Park and all these areas. They're all becoming part of the Austin metro area. And unfortunately, the cost of living is also going up in those areas too. Like even in Bastrop, which is about 25 miles away from Austin, the houses there are very expensive. So I just wanted to use that as an aside. So, and then of course, obviously, of course, we have the Native American groups here in Texas, different types. And we had the Caddo Native Americans in the, in the Piney Woods. Obviously, we have the Comanches out west. We have the Coahuiltecans here in South Texas, and the Carancawas along the coastal bend area. So all different types of tribes here, that call Texas home. But then of course we have the Spanish come over, and they established, the missions, like in Nacogdoches, as well as, in San Antonio. And, those become the three permanent European settlements at first, within Texas. Now, of course, also what's interesting about our own unique history down here is that some of the cities that have been founded here on either side of the Rio Grande, whether it's Matamoros or Roma, Camargo, and then Revilla, which isn't around now, but it's where Zapata is, and then even up towards Laredo. These communities were founded by Jose de Escandon. You probably have heard of his name. There's like several elementaries named after him. He was the Spaniard that launched the expedition, to settle both sides of the Rio Grande. And that's why a lot of these communities like Laredo, they used to be one community where the Rio Grande just went through the middle, and they weren't different communities. It's kind of like the way Austin is with the Colorado River, and Waco with the Brazos River. Like in Waco, right? It's the cities on both sides of the river. That's the way Laredo used to be before it was split up. And so obviously, of course, then we have the non-Native American rapid expansion with Stephen F. Austin bringing the original 300. And of course, and this is probably the most documented aspect of Texas history, the Alamo and the Texas Revolution. So what I want for us to definitely understand about what were some of the tensions that were occurring. There were some government tensions. What I mean by this is that there were some differences of opinion in terms of how the Texans should be governed, right? Because a lot of these people that were coming over to Texas were, and of course, let's also mention that the main reason why Spain and then eventually the Mexican government was wanting for these these Americans to come over to Texas was they were concerned that the United States, as the United States was expanding westward, that Texas and California and all these other states would be that the United States would be interested in wanting to purchase them. I mean, California as well, right? I mean, that was definitely documented that California, the United States wanted to purchase California, and so the Spanish and then eventually the Mexicans, and after Mexico gained their independence from Spain in 1821, they wanted to have these Americans come over to kind of act like as a buffer type of thing. Like, okay, maybe the United States won't be so quick to go into Texas and California if there's already maybe some of their own people there living, so maybe they can kind of have some coexist a little bit with some some good relationships and types of things. So that was their goal, because Texas at the time was still very sparsely populated. Just again, like I said, those couple of small outposts in Nacogdoches and San Antonio. So there was so there of course was that concern. And of course, let's not also forget that the French also with La Salle, the French also tried to set up a outpost in Texas at Fort St. Louis, because they La Salle thought he was going towards Louisiana, but he was blown off course and ended up west in the Western Gulf, moving into Texas, right? So let's also not forget that. But regardless of that, but the point is that this was why the Texans ended up coming over. But unfortunately, there were some major cultural differences. The language was a major difference, right? And of course, the requirement that the Mexicans did have this requirement that whoever was coming over to live in Mexico, because again, this is when Texas was part of Mexico, that they had to obviously learn Spanish, they had to convert to Roman Catholicism, and slavery was also, originally it was sort of allowed, but then Mexico abolished it in 1830, and so this caused a lot of tension, right? The language barrier was too much. Also, the cultural barrier too, right? Because you have the mestizo Mexicanos interacting with the Anglo whites, and so it was just there was just too many cultural differences that really caused a lot of tension. And then the tension also grew with the rise of power of Antonio Lopez de Santana, and what he did was he centralized the governments throughout the states in Mexico, and he took power from the local governments and he consolidated it into a strong national government. Now, also keep in mind, this is very eerily similar to what we saw in the American Revolution, right? Because didn't King George III did something very similar, right? He consolidated power. He obviously, of course, Parliament was passing, the Tea Acts, the Intolerable Acts, and so the colonists in 13 colonies felt that they weren't being, heard in Parliament, right? No taxation without representation, the famous line. So the Texas Revolution has a lot of similarities to the American Revolution in that you had a strong, overbearing central government trying to take local control away from the local governments. Because originally Mexico kind of let the Texans kind of do their own thing, just kind of kind of make their own decisions, and so that's why a lot of these people that were coming over to Texas a lot of them were in the Jacksonian. A lot of them were fans of Andrew Jackson, who was, rather conservative and believed more in state and local government control. A lot of these people that were coming over to Texas came over from southern states, like Sam Houston coming over from Tennessee. So they brought that conservative, less government philosophy with them, and that was in conflict with the strong national centralized government of Santana, right? So that caused these tensions. Of course, obviously we have the Texas War for Independence with the siege of San Antonio. Of course, the Battle of the Alamo and how that went. Mexicanos, of course, defeating Davy Crockett and Sam Bowie and Colonel Travis there at the Alamo, and then obviously then Sam Houston is able to get their revenge, and they're able to wipe out the Mexican forces of the Battle of San Jacinto near Houston, which ultimately ensures Texas becomes independent. It wasn't unstable independence, though, because Texas was dealing with tons of inflation. They didn't have too much asset. The only real major asset they had was a lot of land, and even that land was disputed by Mexico. Like there was dispute in terms of where the border was between between Texas and Mexico. And this tension was still happening throughout the 10 years that Texas was an independent republic. But then this tension would really, rise to fruition when Texas was admitted as the 28th state, and then we had the Mexican-American War, which resulted, and of course we had the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically secured Texas being part of the United States, and also Mexico lost their territory, California, the American Southwest, the modern day American Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, Colorado, Nevada, because the Mexican forces were defeated by the Americans. And the Mexican-American War is also very noteworthy because this was kind of like the coming out party for some of these major American historical military figures that you might be familiar with, like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant. Winfield Scott was, the top American general at the time. But the up and comers were Grant and Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was going to, if you've studied American history, you'll know that Robert E. Lee was going to be Lincoln's first choice, to basically be in charge of the Union Army. That's how good he was. He was the top military officer in the country at the time, but he could not bear to fight against his state of Virginia, right? He loved his state of Virginia more than he did the United States, and so that's why he resigned from his military post, and then he ultimately joined the Confederacy, right? So this is where a lot of these these up and coming military figures were able to get their big break, so to speak, in the Mexican American War. So then, obviously, of course, the United States wins. The beginning of political parties in Texas. So we have Sam Houston, obviously, of course, being considered like the father of Texas. Obviously, of course, defeating Santana in the Battle of San Jacinto, he was able to become the first president of Texas. He served again later on, and then he became one of the 2 senators from Texas. He was that incredibly popular, and then of course he would also become governor of Texas when Texas decided to join the Confederacy. But Sam Houston did not go along with it. Not necessarily that he was a fan of Lincoln, so to speak, but Sam Houston had the foresight to know that Texas would not be able to stand against the Union as part of the Confederacy. So Texas, of course, obviously secedes in the Convention of 1861, and then Texas, of course, is defeated by the Union forces. Just also a couple of notes here that there wasn't a lot of fighting in Texas in terms of the Civil War. A lot of the fighting was going on to the east. Like you're familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Antietam. So Gettysburg, obviously in southern Pennsylvania. Antietam was in Maryland. It was also the Battle of Shiloh, and some of these major battles. Texas did have a few battles, such as the Battle of Sabine Pass. We also had Shelby's army, moving west to try to make their way to California, to try to see if they could conquer California for the Confederacy, because they felt that would provide more legitimacy for the Confederacy, because the Confederacy was trying to be recognized by some of the major countries of the world at the time, such as Great Britain, France. If they could get international recognition as being their own independent nation, that would go a long way towards allowing for some of these countries to maybe even come to their aid. Of course, we also have to keep in mind that France at the time was preoccupied, because remember that this is the time where France is in Mexico right now, right? France is in Mexico, and then of course that leads to the Battle of Puebla, and of course, obviously, Cinco de Mayo, is not Mexican Independence Day, right? It's to commemorate the battle there during, to fight back against the French. So that, so France is also preoccupied with that at the time. So okay, anyway, so but then obviously, of course, as you all know, obviously, of course, the Union defeats the Confederacy, and then we have Juneteenth, which in the last couple of years has become a new national holiday. And of course, the significance of Juneteenth was this was when Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was finally able to be enforced. Once the Union had defeated the Confederacy, this was the official, the official way for for the former African American slaves to officially be free. Because yes, they had been declared free in the Emancipation Proclamation, but you also have to remember that they had to win the war first, right? It's not like the Southerners were like, okay, Lincoln said you're free to go. Like obviously, of course, they had to have won the war in order to actually enforce it. So that's when the Emancipation Proclamation was finally being enforced, on June 19th, 1865, over in Galveston, and that, of course, is the significance what it has to Texas history. Okay, really quickly, because as you can see, I'm trying to go through the history aspect of this really quickly. Okay, so legacy of Civil War. So obviously, of course, the Black Codes. We've got the Jim Crow era that's starting to creep up here. Before that, of course, we have the Radical Republicans and Reconstruction. So we're going to talk more about them in Chapter 2. We're going to talk about Governor E.J. Davis and what he wanted to do in Texas, and basically trying to morph Texas to look more like the federal government. And of course, through Reconstruction, because you have to remember that Reconstruction was not just to reconstruct the buildings that were destroyed, right? And like I mentioned, Texas didn't see that much fighting. A lot of the fighting was going on towards the east. So Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital, Atlanta, Georgia, they suffered immense destruction. Like buildings just completely leveled to rubble. Like it just definitely in need of reconstructing. But it wasn't just the reconstruction of the buildings. It was also reconstruction of society. So you also needed to integrate the newly freed African American slaves into American society. So that's where the Radical Republicans come in, with the Republican establishment of military government to ensure that the African Americans would now be able to exercise their rights, because we also have the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments at this time. And I know I'm throwing you all a lot of information, so if you need to go back and watch this again, you're more than welcome to do so. But once the war ends and we have the passage of these amendments, right? The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment provides citizenship rights to the African Americans, and then the 15th Amendment provides the voting rights for the African American men. Remember that women still don't get the right to vote nationally until we get the 19th Amendment, which would be passed in 1920. So with this being said, the obviously, of course, the African Americans are going to align themselves with the Republicans, because the Republicans, being the party of Lincoln, the party of the abolitionist movement, which Lincoln was not an abolitionist at the time. He, when the war started, he wanted to just try to keep, the slavery from moving to the north, right? Because we also had the Dred Scott decision, which basically said that you couldn't limit slavery to only certain parts of the country; that slavery could happen everywhere. So Lincoln was trying to make sure that slavery could only be contained to the South. But then eventually, they changed their position to where they did believe in total abolishment of slavery. So obviously, of course, African Americans are going to be with the Republicans for that reason, and then the whites align themselves with the Democrat Party. The Democrats were the conservative party at the time. We'll talk about the party realignments later, but remember that at the time, the Democrats are considered the conservatives. So then we have the end of Reconstruction. E.J. Davis is defeated. We have the Democrats taking over, and they go with the Constitution of 1876, which is the current Constitution that we still follow to this day, right? And it's this return to the Jeffersonian democratic principles, like I was referencing a little while ago, right? Limited government, not having too much government involvement, only what is totally necessary, right? And so that's going to go hand in hand with low taxes, because if the government isn't doing much of anything, doesn't have that many responsibilities, then it doesn't need to collect too many taxes to accomplish those goals, right? Because if they only got a few things to do, then it shouldn't be that expensive to get those things done. So that's why limited government and low taxes tend to go hand in hand. And so again, very conservative ideas. And so that's the Constitution that we've operated on to this day here. So really quickly, let's kind of go through some of the industries here, and then we'll finish up here when it comes to the we'll go through the industries really quickly, and then we'll get to the political culture. And I know I think we have about 20 minutes left, so let's see if we can go through this really quickly. So, excuse me, sometimes I need to take a little swig of water. Okay, so when we look at the late 19th century, so obviously, of course, now we have the 1876 Constitution that it's been established, and that sets the tone for how Texas is going to do business, not just within their government, but also how they do business with the private sector, so state government and large corporations. So obviously, of course, you mentioned before cotton. King cotton is the major cash crop within Texas. It's how Texas, is able to sustain themselves. Let me also mention one quick note on King Cotton and what was going on in the Civil War. Um, do keep in mind that when the Civil War was declared, that one of the first things that Lincoln did was he ordered for there to be a blockade of all of the ports there in the South, like Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans. They were not going to be able to ship items out or receive supplies coming in to try to weaken the Confederacy, right? So Texas needed to find a way to get their cotton out to the world market. And so what they were doing to try to bypass the blockade was to smuggle a lot of this cotton south, past the Rio Grande into Mexico and then get it out that way. This is the main reason as to why Abraham Lincoln decided to send some military forces from Brownsville and move up the Rio Grande to create a blockade to keep the cotton runners from being able to go into Mexico. And this led to some battles such as the Battle of Laredo, where the Santos Benavides, the highest ranking Hispanic in the Confederate Army, was able to drive back the Union forces back south, towards Brownsville. So again, this is interesting. There's so much interesting history. You can tell that I'm like a history person, right? You can tell that I definitely like our local history. We've got tons of local history, right? If Texas has really great history, so does the Valley. We've got a bunch of interesting local history. So I just want to make that as an aside. But yes, but obviously, of course, after the Civil War ends, then the cotton is able to still, still able to be exported. The railroads is a great way for the cotton to be exported now, right? And of course, with the railroads coming in, this also put an end to the cattle drives. This is also the time when we had the famous, like the Chisholm Trail, the cattle drives, moving north, from the Panhandle and West Texas, even South Texas, and moving up north towards Kansas, right? Like Dodge City and Wichita, to be able to send those, the cattle to be sent forth on railroads there, right? Because the railroads hadn't gotten to Texas yet. So they had to drive the cattle to the closest railroads, which were there in Kansas. But then once the railroads were able to make their way into Texas, this pretty much put an end to the cattle drives, because now there was no need to drive them, up toward those railroads, because now they were here locally. And of course, unfortunately, we also have to talk a little bit about the Jim Crow era and what was going on in white supremacy with the rampant discrimination that was going on. Of course, I'm sure you all are familiar with what was going on in the American South in terms of separating of the races. Of course, this leads us to the Plessy versus Ferguson case, one of the most infamous cases, which reaffirmed the separate but equal doctrine, which then would be overturned in Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s. But for now, of course, we still have that separation. And it's not just for African Americans; also Hispanics and Asians were also being heavily discriminated against. We also see the beginning of organized labor and the National Grange movement, and also populism. All this goes together because the Grange movement was fighting back against the railroads, who were being very unscrupulous. What I mean by this is that the railroads were charging people exorbitant amount of fees to be able to transport their goods, right? You've got these ranchers, with cattle being, need to be sent on the railroads, or farmers who want to send their crops. The railroads basically could charge whatever they want to, and people were outraged because they weren't making any profit. Like, the fees were too expensive. The transport fees were way too expensive, and so what was the point of having that branch or that farm to do business if they weren't going to make any money, if the railroads were ripping them off? So this led to the National Grange movement to try to advocate for more regulation of the railroads by the state government, and that also led us to this idea of populism. Populism is this idea that that this might sound familiar, right? Because Trump is considered a populist, so is Bernie Sanders. Where they talk about like, oh, like the system's corrupt, you can't trust the government, this, like that. That's kind of like what populism is, right? Where it tries to so-called put the power with the people, right? The people are the ones who should be in control of everything, not these corporations that are ripping you off, type of thing, right? So that was the discussion that was going on at the time, because obviously, of course, like I mentioned, and you can look this up as well in your book. You can see that that unfortunately the railroads, because they weren't being regulated, were allowed to, charge these inordinate fees and things like that. So, okay, anyway, so then moving on, of course, to the rise of the oil industry, of course, Standard Oil Company, Rockefeller's company, which was trying to buy out all of these smaller oil companies and consolidate it into one big monopoly here. And of course, what this has to do with Texas, of course, obviously we have Spindletop, right? So Spindletop, 1901, oil is discovered in Texas, and so this is where we see all these, these oil rigs going up everywhere. And we do see, some of these reforms that are put in place, right? So like the territorial election law established primary elections, antitrust laws, and child labor laws. So we can see that there's more of this progressivism that's going on at the turn of the century, because during the early 20th century, this is the time of the progressive movement, right? This is the time of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, trying to progress, with some of these reforms, right? This is also the rise of the unions, right? The unions also are starting to become, more popular, and they're trying to fight back against some of these companies and things like that. And of course, we also have continuing racial tension, the poll tax, which was implemented. Basically people had to pay to vote, and so this affected, this affected poor people who were not able to pay, because they were looked at it just as kind of like, like a luxury. And then the white primary also only allowed for white people to run in the primary system. Now, we'll talk about the primaries later on in this class, but basically the primaries are the elections before the general election, right? This is the election of people of the same party vying for the, for that nomination for that position. This is why we had a Republican debate a couple of weeks ago, because it's not a formality that, Trump is going to be the nominee, right? Of course, he's leading, but there's also people that also want to get in on this, right? So that's why you have all these people that are debating, like Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, and some of these other people who want that nomination, and so they go through that process. But the point is that under the old white primary system, the only people that could run in the primary were white people. So this basically meant that, for all intents and purposes, only white people could ultimately be elected, because in order to be eligible to run on the ballot, you have to win your party's primary. And of course, the parties were making the argument that because political parties are a private company or a private organization, that they felt that they had the right to decide who they let into the parties. But of course, that's been struck down because of the fact that the parties serve a public purpose, right? Yes, they are private organizations, but they're involved in public elections. So there is, there definitely is, and of course, even nowadays, of course, that wouldn't fly because of the, the civil rights, acts and all that stuff, But anyway, but that was the argument they made. Okay, so of course, obviously, we also saw that Texas has also had the expansion of military bases both in World War I and World War II. Okay, let's see if we can kind of go through this, because I know we kind of need to kind of get through this really quickly here. So, because I know we have about 10 minutes left. So just also note that after World War II, of course, we have the population shifts. Texas, shifts from a rural state to being a much more urban state. Major manufacturing areas such as Houston, the Dallas Metroplex, San Antonio, they start to grow. Houston, of course, obviously they get the space exploration business, the industry, with NASA setting up there in Johnson Space Center. So that also helps, to modernize Houston more. Again, conservative Democratic control still continues, and the influx of immigration. So this is where you have immigrations, immigration mostly from Mexico, as well as from Central South America, now starting to come into Texas here, and this is definitely increasing the Latino population. Late 20th century Texas, growing diversity in the political arena. Now we have this is also that political realignment here, where the former conservative Democrats are starting to move to the Republican Party, for different reasons, for states' rights, as well as also an aftermath of the American Civil Rights Movement, led by Dr. King and Malcolm X, and all those, Rosa Parks and all those important figures in the 1950s and 60s. Then of course we also got oil boom and bust. The 1970s saw, issues when it came to inflation, and that of course caused a lot. The price of oil also tumbled. Lots of political instigation going on in the Middle East, like that was during the time of the Tehran hostage situation. So this caused for Texas to undergo a lot of this this economic poverty here, right, and things like that. So, but then of course we've also transitioned to high tech industries, like I mentioned. So now Texas has become a lot more diverse when it comes to their economy. We've got like I said, Tesla and AT&T, a lot of these telecommunications, and of course NASA's still here, and even SpaceX now, here locally here, over in Brownsville. So some modern hardships, of course, September 11th, and of course, that caused a transformation of American society, like with the Patriot Act and how the increase in surveillance and now the war on terror. And of course, we've got a couple of hurricanes that have affected us. Hurricane Katrina, not directly, but the way that Texas, of course, was affected was because of a lot of the refugees that were from New Orleans, because Katrina hit New Orleans. And a lot of those refugees went to Houston, and a lot of them, ended up staying there. So Houston, their population grew, because of the refugees coming over from New Orleans. Hurricane Harvey, of course, also affected Houston. That was a really, really bad storm. The Houston area was extremely flooded. And I always like to share this story because I was actually in Houston the week before Harvey hit. I went to an Astros game, and then I was seeing the pictures of how the downtown was just so flooded, and I was like, wow, like I was just there, like it was just it was unreal to see just how much water was there, and the strong winds hit like Refugio and Rockport and all that area, like even a year later when I would drive on 59, driving through Refugio, either coming back from Houston or going to Houston, you would still see those blue tarps, like even like a year later, which is very, very difficult. And of course, we had the issues with COVID that started in 2020, and of course the shutdowns and of course causing rapid unemployment and things like that. So thankfully, things have gotten better. When it comes to the economy, and thankfully also with the virus too. It's something we're still dealing with, but at least it's nowhere near as bad as how it first started, right? And then of course racial criticism, of course the George Floyd incident that happened in Minneapolis, and of course obviously of course George Floyd having ties to Texas, having gone to Kingsville, and also being from the Houston area. So obviously of course and we'll talk a little bit more about Black Lives Matter and how that plays an effect here. So okay, because I know we still have a little bit more to go, and all right, okay, so here's what I can do for you all, everyone. Okay, so I don't think there's going to be enough time to go over all of this, but what I can try to do is maybe we can try to, because I definitely do want to finish this, and we would have definitely finished this if if we had class on Monday, things like that. Here's what we can do, and let me go ahead and stop the share here. Okay, sorry. Okay, stop the share. Okay, hold on. Let me stop the share here. Okay, so here's what I think we can do. Or you know what? Let me go ahead and stop the recording. Hold on, let me stop. Where do I stop? Oh, right here. Okay.